The sky was grey that morning, the kind of dull color that makes everything feel heavier. I stood by the graves, clutching a handful of white lilies. My parents' caskets were side by side, and I still couldn't believe they were gone. The car accident had taken them both so suddenly that I hadn't even had time to say goodbye. People from the neighborhood and my parents' old friends filled the cemetery, offering quiet words I could barely hear. Derek stood beside me, silent. He'd barely said a word since we got here. I thought he was just being respectful, but his eyes weren't sad. They were distant, cold. When the pastor began the final prayer, Derek leaned closer. I thought he was going to comfort me. Instead, he whispered, "We need to talk. I want a divorce." At first, I thought I misheard him. The sound of shovels moving dirt covered his voice, and I stared at him, waiting for him to say it was a mistake. But he didn't. He just straightened his suit jacket and looked away, like what he'd said was the most normal thing in the world. My heart stopped. All around me, people were crying for my parents. I couldn't even cry for them anymore. My tears froze somewhere between heartbreak and disbelief. My husband, the man who had held my hand through every storm, had just decided to walk away, right here, at the worst moment of my life. I turned my face toward the graves to hide the trembling in my jaw. The priest's voice faded into a blur. My chest hurt so badly it felt like something inside me was tearing apart. Derek didn't say another word. He didn't even touch my shoulder. He just stood there, staring at the dirt, as if my entire world wasn't falling apart beside him. When the service ended, people came up to hug me. "Stay strong," they said. I nodded, pretending I hadn't just heard my marriage die beside my parents' resting place. Derek thanked a few guests politely, avoiding my eyes. When I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw it, the absence. The love that used to live in his eyes was gone, replaced by something hard, final. I didn't ask him why. I didn't have the strength to fight, not there, not on that day. My hands were shaking too much to hold the flowers properly. As everyone began to leave, I stayed back, watching the last bit of earth cover my parents' caskets. The wind was cold against my face, but my body felt numb. When Derek walked away toward the parking lot without saying goodbye, I stood still. I didn't follow. I didn't call out. I just kept staring at the ground and whispered to myself, "You picked the wrong day to show me who you really are." Somewhere deep inside, beneath all the pain, something small but fierce started to wake up. It wasn't anger yet. It was the quiet awareness that everything had changed, and there was no going back. Before everything fell apart, I used to believe Derek was the person I could count on forever. We had been together for 9 years, and I thought we understood each other without even speaking. He was calm where I was emotional, logical where I was impulsive. My parents loved him from the start. My father once said, "He's steady, the kind of man who'll never let you fall." I believed that. I trusted Derek more than anyone in the world. We met during my junior year of college. I was studying interior design, dreaming of creating spaces that made people feel at home. Derek was majoring in finance, always buried in books, always talking about numbers and markets. He wasn't the kind of guy who made big romantic gestures, but he had this quiet confidence that made me feel safe. When he asked me out, I thought I'd found the kind of love that only existed in stories. After graduation, we rented a small apartment before buying our first home in Connecticut. It was a little 2-story house with chipped paint and creaky floors, but I adored it. My parents helped us with the down payment. My mother said it was their way of making sure I had a good start. I remember Derek promising he'd pay them back, but my parents waved it off. They trusted him as much as I did. The first few years of marriage were good. Simple, steady. We didn't have much, but we had each other. I'd work on small design projects while Derek built his career at a local investment firm. He'd come home late some nights, but he always had an excuse: client dinners, networking events, important deadlines. I didn't question it. I thought he was just trying to build a future for us. But something started to shift about a year before my parents passed. Derek became colder. The little things that used to connect us disappeared. He stopped asking how my day was, stopped noticing when I stayed up late working. He didn't smile the same way anymore. At dinner, he'd sit across from me scrolling through his phone, pretending to check emails. When I asked if something was wrong, he'd sigh and say, "I'm just tired, Lucy. Don't start." At first, I believed him. I told myself marriage goes through phases. Everyone gets distant sometimes. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The warmth between us had faded, replaced by a quiet wall I couldn't break through. Then I started hearing a new name, Tessa Moore. He mentioned her casually, said she was his firm's new business consultant. The way he said her name felt too easy, too familiar. When I asked how long they'd been working together, he said, a few months. She's sharp. You'd like her. But his eyes avoided mine when he said it. I didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of the end. The first small crack in the life I thought was solid. I wanted to believe it was just work, just stress, just one of those rough seasons couples go through. But in my heart, I already knew something was slipping away, and no matter how hard I tried to hold on, Derek was already somewhere else. That night, the house was painfully quiet. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall while the sound of the shower ran in the background. My body felt heavy, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I kept replaying Derek's words at the funeral, wondering how someone could be so cruel, so heartless, and still sleep soundly next to me. I told myself I just needed answers. Maybe there was more to it. Maybe I was missing something. His phone was on the nightstand, face down. I'd never gone through it before, not once in 9 years. I used to think that meant trust. But now, it just felt like blindness. My hands trembled as I picked it up, pressing my thumb to unlock it. His password hadn't changed. That felt like the last bit of luck I'd ever have with him. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Work emails, news alerts, a few messages from friends. But when I scrolled further, I found her name, Tessa Moore. It was like the world went still for a second. I opened the chat. The first thing I saw was a picture of the two of them at a restaurant I knew too well. It was where Derek and I used to go every Friday. The message above it read, "Next time, don't wear that tie. I like the blue one better." My stomach turned. I scrolled up and saw messages that went back months. Compliments, inside jokes, things he used to say to me. Then came the hotel confirmations, the weekend trips, and a message that stopped me cold. "I wish I could spend our anniversary with you instead." That was the same weekend Derek told me he was on a company retreat in Boston. I remembered calling him that night, and how he'd said, "I'm exhausted, I'll call you tomorrow." Now I knew he wasn't tired. He was just with her. My fingers felt numb as I kept scrolling. There were photos too. Him smiling in a way I hadn't seen in years, holding her hand, leaning close to her in ways he never did with me anymore. I couldn't breathe. It felt like every memory we'd built had just shattered into tiny, sharp pieces. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone, to wake him up and demand he look me in the eyes. But then, something inside me shifted. I remembered my mother's voice, calm and steady, from years ago. "Never let anger make your first move, let it make your last." I set the phone down, wiped my face, and forced myself to breathe. My chest was tight, but my thoughts were suddenly clear. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't even going to cry in front of him. Instead, I opened my laptop and started taking pictures of everything. The messages, the receipts, the photos. Every single piece of proof. I saved them all on a hidden drive. When Derek walked out of the bathroom a few minutes later, wrapped in a towel, he smiled like nothing was wrong. "You still awake?" he asked. I nodded, pretending to be half asleep. "Yeah," I said softly, turning away. "Just couldn't stop thinking." He chuckled and kissed the top of my head. "Try to rest." I did rest, but only long enough to plan what came next. If Derek wanted a divorce, he would get it. But by the time I was done, it would cost him everything he ever took for granted. The next morning, I acted like nothing had changed. Derek made coffee, checked his phone, and talked about selling the house as if we were just planning another move. His voice was calm, almost gentle, and that made it worse. He didn't look like a man who felt guilty. He looked like someone who had already erased me from his future. When he said, "It's better if we end things peacefully," I smiled and agreed. "Of course," I said. My voice didn't shake. I even thanked him for being honest, and he seemed relieved. Inside, though, my thoughts were cold and clear. I knew what I had to do. The game was over for him, but I wasn't going to walk away empty-handed. That afternoon, while he went to work, I called Marianne Keller. She had been my parents' lawyer for years and had always treated me like family. I hadn't spoken to her since the funeral, but when she answered and heard my voice, she said softly, "Lucy, I'm so sorry about your parents. How are you holding up?" "I'm not," I admitted, "and I need your help." We met the next day in her office, a quiet place filled with books, old files, and the faint smell of coffee. I sat across from her, explaining everything from the divorce to the messages with Tessa. I told her about the inheritance my parents left us, how Derek handled the investments, the properties, the accounts. She listened carefully, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression tightening. "Let me guess," she said. "He used your parents' money for his business projects." I nodded. "He said he'd grow it for us." I trusted him completely. Marianne sighed and reached for a folder. "Luce, I remember how your parents set up those accounts. They made you the primary holder. Derek might think everything was in both your names, but legally, those investments are yours. Every penny." I blinked. "Are you sure?" She nodded firmly. "I drafted those papers myself. Your father insisted on protecting your share. Derek never had full access. He only managed the accounts under your approval. If he moved money without your written consent, that's a problem for him, not you." A strange calm settled over me. For the first time since the funeral, I felt like I could breathe. Marianne handed me a notepad. "Start listing everything he's touched: accounts, properties, transfers. The more details, the better. We'll track every dollar." That night, while Derek worked late, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and went through years of statements. I found transfers he'd made into his company, withdrawals labeled as investment opportunities, and transactions that went straight to accounts I'd never seen before. I made copies of everything. Each document, each number, felt like another piece of armor. When Derek came home, he kissed my forehead and said, "You're being so understanding. I didn't expect this to be so easy." I smiled again, looking straight into his eyes. Neither did I. He had no idea the storm was already forming right under his roof, and this time, I was the one writing the forecast. The weeks that followed felt like living two lives at once. On the surface, I was calm, cooperative, even kind. Derek believed I had accepted the divorce, that I was ready to move on peacefully. I let him think that. I cooked dinner, made small talk, and even smiled when he talked about his business plans. But every night after he fell asleep, I sat quietly in the study with files spread out across the table, connecting the dots one by one. Derek had always handled our investments, claiming he had a better head for numbers. I let him, because I trusted him and because my parents had trusted him too. They were the ones who helped us open the brokerage account years ago, calling it a way to secure our future. What Derek never realized was that my parents, cautious as always, had kept me as the primary holder. Every cent that went in was technically under my authority. He might have moved the money around, but he never owned it. Through the records Marianne helped me gather, we found that Derek had been transferring funds from that account into his own company under the label of Joint Investment Growth. On paper, it looked harmless, like a husband managing his family's finances. But legally, it was different. He had been spending my money, not ours. Every deal he made, every property he bought, every so-called project he funded was tied to my inheritance. When Marianne confirmed it, I felt something sharp twist inside me, not anger, but clarity. She said, "You don't have to stop him, Luce. Just keep watching. Let him make the next move." So I did. A week later, Derek told me he was selling one of our rental properties. He said it was to simplify things before the divorce. I nodded, pretending not to care. What he didn't know was that I had already informed Marianne. She began tracking each sale, each transfer, and every dollar that landed in his accounts. I remember one evening when Derek came home, excited. He poured himself a drink and said, "Once this deal closes, I'll finally be free of all this stress." He smiled like a man who thought he'd won something. I watched him closely and said softly, "That's good, Derek. You deserve peace." Inside, I knew exactly what he deserved, to face what he'd done. Each time he sold something or moved funds, Marianne filed the documentation. We had timestamps, contracts, receipts, all proving he had been misusing assets he didn't own. Every action he took made our case stronger. It was strange, watching him build what he thought was an empire, knowing it was really a trap of his own making. The more confident he became, the less careful he was. He was too busy dreaming about his new life to realize I was quietly collecting every piece of evidence that would destroy the one he already had. By the time he noticed something was wrong, it would be too late. The foundation he stood on wasn't his, it was mine. And soon, everything he built with my money would crumble right beneath him. A week later, Derek came home early from work, wearing the same navy suit he always wore for meetings. He didn't look nervous or regretful. He looked satisfied, almost proud. He placed a thin envelope on the dining table in front of me. "It's time to make this official," he said. His tone was calm, rehearsed, like this was just another deal to close. I stared at the envelope for a moment before opening it. The papers inside were crisp and cold. Our divorce agreement. My name, his name, the terms, the signatures. It was all there, waiting for me to sign away nearly a decade of my life. He didn't even sit down. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching me read through it like I was an employee signing a form. When I reached the section about asset division, I noticed how carefully he had written it. He wanted the house, one of the cars, and a portion of shared investments. It was written as if we both had contributed equally, as if he hadn't built his entire business using my parents' inheritance. My chest tightened, but I didn't show it. "You'll be fine," Derek said casually, pouring himself a drink from the counter. "You still have your parents' money. You'll land on your feet." I looked up at him, and for the first time, I saw him clearly, the arrogance, the entitlement, the complete lack of remorse. It was like everything we had been through meant nothing to him. I wanted to yell. I wanted to ask him how he could be so heartless. But instead, I breathed slowly, letting the silence stretch between us. Then I picked up the pen and signed the papers, one page at a time, careful and slow. When I finished, I looked at him and said, "I have something for you too." I reached into my folder and pulled out another envelope, thick, sealed, and marked with his name. I slid it across the table toward him. He frowned. "What's this?" "Just something you'll want to read later," I said softly. He smirked, clearly uninterested. "You're not going to make this hard, right?" His voice had that same fake charm he used on clients, smooth, condescending, confident. I smiled faintly and met his eyes. "Oh, Derek," I said quietly, "you have no idea how hard it's about to get." He laughed under his breath, shaking his head like I was being dramatic. Then he tucked the envelope under his arm, grabbed his drink, and walked out. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed through the empty house. The moment he left, I exhaled. My hands were still steady, my heart oddly calm. Inside that envelope was the first set of evidence, documents showing every unauthorized transfer, every property he'd sold using my capital. I knew he wouldn't open it right away. Derek never looked too closely at the things he thought he controlled. I sat there for a long time, staring at the signed divorce papers. The silence felt different now, not empty, but ready. The calm before everything broke loose. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't the broken one. Derek thought this was the end. He had no idea it was just the beginning of his downfall. 2 weeks after I handed Derek the envelope, things began to shift. Marianne worked quickly, filing a claim for financial misconduct on my behalf. Every document, every transaction we had gathered was now in the hands of the court. It didn't take long before the first blow landed. The judge approved a temporary freeze on all of Derek's business accounts while the investigation began. The news must have reached him within hours, because that evening my phone started lighting up with messages. At first, they were short and polite. "Can we talk?" Then they turned desperate. "What did you do? You're making a mistake." By the third day, they were angry. "You'll regret this, Lucy." I didn't answer any of them. I didn't need to. Marianne told me to stay silent and let the law speak for me. Then one morning, Derek showed up at my office without warning. My assistant came in looking uneasy and said, "There's a man outside asking for you. Says it's urgent." I knew before she said his name. He stormed in, eyes wild, tie loosened, his face pale like he hadn't slept in days. "You're ruining my life," he shouted. His voice echoed through the quiet office. A few coworkers glanced in from the hallway, but I didn't flinch. I stood up slowly, keeping my tone steady. "You did that yourself when you ruined mine." He froze, staring at me like he didn't recognize the person standing in front of him. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his voice shaking. "They froze everything. My accounts, my company cards, everything." I folded my arms. "Then maybe you should have thought about that before spending money that wasn't yours." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You think this is just about you? You're dragging other people down too." That's when I realized he didn't even know the full picture yet. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because what Derek didn't realize was that Tessa's name appeared on several of those same financial documents. Some of the transfers he'd made had gone directly into joint accounts they shared, using funds that legally belonged to me. Marianne had discovered it days earlier. That meant Tessa wasn't just his secret, she was his accomplice. By the time the investigators reviewed the files, both of them were flagged for fraudulent appropriation of marital assets. The court wanted explanations, and fast. I watched as Derek's expression changed from anger to confusion, then fear. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of what he'd done was finally starting to crush him. He muttered something about fixing it, but I didn't respond. There was nothing left to fix. He left the office without another word. I sat back down, my hands steady, my heart calm. Outside the window, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. For 9 years, I'd believed Derek could protect me. Now, the only thing he needed protection from was the truth, and it was already closing in on him. Within a few days, Derek's world began to crumble. His firm let him go, claiming the investigation made him too much of a liability. His office cleared out overnight, the familiar hum of phones and computers replaced by silence. He tried to call Tessa, to reason with her, to beg her for help, but she stopped answering. It was as if she had vanished the moment the subpoenas arrived. I watched it all from a distance, keeping myself busy with the things that mattered. I spent long hours with Marianne, going over the legal details, making sure every document, every transaction, and every property transfer was airtight. At home, I focused on rebuilding what mattered most, my parents' house. Derek had never cared about it. It had been a safe, quiet place that held years of memories, and I was determined to bring it back to life. Painting the walls, fixing the broken porch, planting flowers in the garden, it gave me purpose, something real to hold onto while he fell apart. Meanwhile, Derek's life outside the courtroom was deteriorating fast. He had to sell his car just to cover mounting legal fees. The watches he loved, symbols of his supposed success, were gone. Even the apartment he had rented in the city, the one he bragged about to colleagues, was on the market, quickly liquidated to pay lawyers and bills. I heard about it from casual news updates and mutual acquaintances, but I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth was unfolding exactly as it should. One evening, as I was planting roses in the garden, my phone lit up. Derek's number flashed on the screen. My fingers hovered for a moment before I finally answered. His voice was weak, cracking in a way I had never heard before. "You took everything," he said. The words were desperate, almost pleading. I leaned against the porch railing, my hands dirty from soil, my face calm. "No, Derek," I said softly, deliberately. "You gave it away. I just made sure it landed where it belonged." There was silence on the other end, broken only by his ragged breathing. I didn't need to say more. The impact of my words hung in the air, heavier than anything I could have shouted. After a moment, he hung up. I set my phone down and turned back to the garden. The roses looked brighter under the fading sun. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. The storm that had overtaken my life was settling, leaving space for something better. Derek was left with the chaos he had created, while I held the life I wanted, quiet, steady, and mine. My parents' home felt warm again, filled with memories and the promise of new beginnings. I wasn't just surviving, I was reclaiming everything he had tried to take from me. And for once, I felt truly free. Months passed, and the legal battle finally came to an end. The court ruled completely in my favor. Every property that Derek had tried to claim was returned to me. The inheritance my parents had left, the funds he had misused, were restored in full. Marianne made sure every document was clear, every account secure. The divorce was finalized cleanly, leaving no room for disputes. Derek had no choice but to file for bankruptcy. His firm had already dismissed him, and without access to the money he had thought was his, he couldn't pay his debts. The houses he had bought, the investments he had made, the cars and watches he had sold off in panic, none of it mattered anymore. Tessa disappeared soon after, leaving town quietly, probably realizing she had nothing left to gain and too much risk to face. I didn't throw a party. I didn't post anything online. There was no celebration, no cheering. What I felt wasn't triumph or revenge. It was a deep, quiet relief. I had lived through betrayal, heartbreak, and manipulation, but I had finally set everything right. That night, I drove to my parents' grave. The cemetery was empty, calm under the glow of the moon and the faint light of street lamps. I sat on the edge of the grass, the cool wind brushing my face. The tombstones of the two people who had shaped my life stared back at me. I touched the marble gently and whispered, "You were right about him. I just wish you were here to see that I finally learned." Sitting there, I thought about everything that had happened. The lies, the stolen trust, the long nights of planning and waiting. I remembered my mother's advice about patience and using anger wisely. I thought about how my father had quietly guided me through life, teaching me to notice things others overlooked. And I realized that everything I had done, every step I had taken, had been in honor of the people who had loved me and protected me. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Derek's downfall was not something I needed to celebrate. It was simply the natural result of his own choices. What mattered was that I had reclaimed my life, rebuilt what had been broken, and finally found a place of peace within myself. I stayed by their graves longer than usual, breathing in the night air, letting the quiet fill me. The house I had restored, the garden I had planted, the life I was beginning to live, all of it felt like proof that even after the darkest storms, there could be calm. When I finally stood to leave, I looked back one last time. I felt no anger, no bitterness. Only closure. The kind of closure that comes not from revenge, but from knowing that justice, patience, and careful planning can restore balance. For the first time in months, I felt whole again. I had survived the betrayal, endured the heartbreak, and emerged stronger. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that I could finally move forward, free from the shadows of the past. A year after everything ended, I finally felt like I was living life on my own terms. I opened a small interior design firm, something I had dreamed about long before Derek came along and distracted me with his plans and ambitions. The office was cozy, filled with natural light and the scent of fresh paint and new furniture. Each corner reflected my style, my taste, and my personality, a place that was completely mine. On the main wall, I hung a framed quote, "Don't burn the woman who once kept you warm. She might learn how to build fire." It was my quiet reminder of the lessons I had learned, the strength I had found, and the boundaries I would never allow anyone to cross again. Clients often noticed it when they walked in. Some asked about it, and I would smile, telling them it was just something that inspired me to stay strong and independent. Business was slowly picking up. I had a few steady clients who appreciated my attention to detail and the way I brought spaces to life. Every project I completed reminded me that I had reclaimed more than just my finances. I had reclaimed my dreams, my voice, and my confidence. The days I spent worrying about Derek, the betrayal, and the court cases felt like a distant memory now. Sometimes, when I passed by the courthouse where the divorce had been finalized, I couldn't help but think about how Derek had looked on that day. Pale, defeated, desperate to grasp at anything he thought he had lost. He had stood there, confident at first, and then slowly realized that the life he had built on my parents' money and my trust had crumbled because he underestimated me. I didn't celebrate his downfall. I didn't need to. I hadn't ruined him. He had done that to himself, step by step, with every bad choice and every lie. All I had done was let the truth work quietly, letting patience and careful planning do the rest. Walking through my office, I often paused at the window and looked outside. The world felt calm and steady. I had learned to appreciate silence, the kind of peace that comes from knowing you've survived betrayal and come out stronger. My parents' guidance, their wisdom, and their love still lived in me, and I felt their presence in every decision I made. Even the nights I worked late, alone with my designs and sketches, felt fulfilling. There was no shadow of Derek in my life anymore, no lingering pain, just focus, growth, and hope. I realized I didn't need revenge to feel empowered. I only needed clarity, courage, and trust in myself. The quiet satisfaction of building my own life, my own dreams, without interference or betrayal, was more powerful than any victory over him could have been. He had thought he could take everything from me. But in the end, he underestimated the quiet woman who loved him enough to let him destroy himself. And that same woman was now free, strong, and unstoppable.